Okay, hi everyone once again, and welcome to our today's session. So as you know, we are now in the guest lecturer phase of our course. And today we have Kaius Sinnemäki with us, who is a professor of quantitative and comparative linguistics at the University of Helsinki. And as I told you already in the beginning of the course, basically his project Linguistic Adaptation, or GRAMADAPT, was largely a source of inspiration for this course and kind of a skeleton on which everything is built. So today we actually get to hear about this project from the main person in charge. So Kaius, we are very happy to have you here, and thank you for agreeing to participate in this course, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Xenia. Thank you very much for the kind invitation to share about this topic in this course. And I hope that all of you will learn new things during today. As Xenia mentioned, my efforts during the past few years have gone into putting together typological and sociolinguistic approaches to language variation. And so this is what I'm going to talk today. I'm going to put some things here away a little bit. And so, yes, let's start. So if you have any questions during my talk, please don't hesitate to send messages to the chat or otherwise pose questions. So yes, so I'm going to talk about a few things related to what we've been doing. So first of all, just some background to language contact research, and then we're going to dive into what we've been doing in this GRAMADAPT project. And there are sort of two different sides to this project that we have then put together. So methodology that we have developed to study and identify linguistic outcomes of contact. And then on the other hand, the sociolinguistic foundations of contact. So what goes on in bilingual or multilingual communities in terms of social interaction, how often they meet, which language is used, and these sorts of things. So there are different hypotheses in earlier research about this, that which sort of factors affect language change in context situations. So we've tried to make sense of that area as well. But because next week, Eri Kashima will give a talk specifically about this sociolinguistic foundation of contact, I won't talk that much about that side of things in this talk. But let's start with just a little bit of background. So I think we can fairly boldly say that contact between human populations that use different languages has existed through human history. And this kind of bilingualism or multilingualism is not something rare, but it's rather something that's quite prevalent in human history, in prehistory, most likely, but also during the known history, and also nowadays. And there are various different kinds of scenarios of bilingualism that stem from these encounters, people speaking different languages, and then they lead to different kinds of linguistic outcomes. So I may talk about bilingualism or multilingualism during this talk, but I sort of use them interchangeably and don't make much of a difference between them. Some focus areas in language contact research concern, for instance, long word research. This is a very, very big area of research in language in the domain of language contact research. Just a very easy and a little bit silly example also about what happens in lexical borrowing situations. So for instance, the word sofa was borrowed from Swedish to Finnish. But very typically when lexemes are borrowed to another language. They are adapted to the host language's phonological system, but not always. And this is an interesting issue also in loanword research, that when this kind of adaptation happens, when it doesn't happen, and what kind of factors affect this adaptation. And one of the things that researchers have debated in this context is, for instance, attitudes towards loanwords and different kinds of other borrowings, how strong purism there is in the community, or how much openness there is to borrowings from different languages. So these are the kinds of themes studied there. Then another issue that is very relevant also for historical linguists is that we can use, for instance, loanwords in relative dating in determining subgroupings of language families. So, for instance, in determining Indo-European subgroupings and their relative datings, in this research, research on Finno-Ugric languages may have been used. So, for instance, in Proto-Germanic, there are these reconstructions, ringas and kuningas, that quite clearly have been borrowed from Finnish, from rengas and kuningas at some point in time. So these kinds of loan words may be used also for relative datings. Then, of course, another very big area in language contact research is research on linguistic areas, or more like geographical areas where all kinds of diffusion processes happen between languages. So linguistic areas could be defined as geographical areas where there is intensive contact that leads to similarities shared by even unrelated languages. So the Balkan Sprachbund is a very typical and much research area. Another one is Southeast Asia, where languages from completely different language families have become quite similar with one another. So it's probably even more striking example of this kind of linguistic area compared to the Balkan Sprachbund. And of course, Baltic Sea area, the languages around the Baltic Sea is another one that may interest many here today. Before we go into any more detail into today's topic, I would like you to, we'll share you into breakout rooms, maybe 3 or 4 persons. So Xenia, if you can do this, and I would like you to just discuss these questions. So Xenia, if you can set it up for maybe for 4 minutes. So what sorts of linguistic materials can be borrowed into another language, and what sorts of examples do you have in your mind, and what sorts of factors may potentially affect these kinds of borrowings? So if you are familiar with any of the literature, so I would like you to discuss these, especially the examples about borrowings. Okay, let's continue. So we already discussed what sort of things can be borrowed. So words, different structural patterns, phonemes. One of the things that characterizes research on, hold on a second, yeah, I skipped something here, sorry. It's been a little while since I used Zoom previously, but yes, okay. So one of the things that characterizes research on language contact, that it's almost completely based on case studies. And there's no comparative approach developed to language contact. Language typology, which I am familiar with, and I've been researching different linguistic phenomena related to argument marking, word order, and other things already for my dissertation. So in typology, we have different methods for making generalizations about the world's languages, but we don't have this kind of an approach for making inferences about language contact across contact scenarios. And this is something that has prevented language contact research also from advancing further. So Bacchus, for instance, about 10 years ago said that contact linguistics, while it has been able to amass a lot of evidence for all kinds of contact phenomena and interesting results, that this whole research area should not be very confident yet that data on sufficient number of case studies have been amassed to know, for instance, what is common and what is not common in language contact. Another issue in language contact research is that it tends to focus on linguistic outcomes of contact rather than the social foundations of bilingualism or multilingualism. But still, many researchers have made hypotheses about, for instance, that the intensity of language contact may impact language change in contact situations. But how then should this intensity of contact be measured? So Thomas and Kaufman, for instance, give these two different parameters. First, time, and then cultural pressure. As for the first parameter, time, the idea there is that we need long-term sustained contact between the communities in order for different kinds of borrowings and especially structural borrowings to happen. And then the other thing is that there needs to be some kind of relatively strong cultural pressure or perhaps economic pressure for one group to attain high level of bilingualism in the dominant language. So these are the kinds of parameters they think. And then based on these parameters, they set up, for instance, this kind of a borrowing scale, that there is casual contact. And when there's just sort of casual social contact between the communities, then that may lead to borrowing of content words like words related to technology, furniture, and what have you, or nowadays artificial intelligence and technology. But then the more pressure there is towards bilingualism, and the more there is intense contact, the more sort of deeper structural things can be borrowed as well, such as adpositions, derivational affixes, so different kind of even morphological properties, phonemes, new phonemes, word order patterns, and even inflectional affixes can be borrowed, or morphophonological rules. But the question remains, despite these kinds of proposals for intensity of contact leading to different kinds of outcomes, we still basically don't know that much about how much the sociolinguistic environment has an impact on linguistic changes across different context scenarios. So to answer that, we actually first need to solve two questions which have not been solved thus far. And one is to create a model for assessing the linguistic outcomes of contact across different languages, so that we have a typological method for that. And then we need some tools for measuring what this intensity of contact means and how to measure it. Or if this idea of intensity of contact actually is not so helpful, should we replace it with something else that is sociolinguistically more reasonable? So now we come to the model that I start sharing. So GrantAdapt project is an ERC starting grant project that was funded in 2018. We started in 2019, and I got some extension to it. So usually it's 5 years, but we continued until June this year. And we have this broad question that's our interest in this project, what we call linguistic adaptation. That does the sociolinguistic context in which languages are learned and used lead to systematic changes in languages? And we apply this question specific to language context situations. And we have proposed this model to language change in context situations that has different bits and pieces and parts that fit together. So a new typological sampling method, then ideas about variable design. So what sorts of linguistic phenomena it makes sense to study in the context of contact research when we do it from a typological perspective. Then how can we make inferences about language context, so assessing contact effects, and then methods for analyzing the social foundations of contact. So this project has been quite a bit about developing methodology, but we've also, of course, analyzed quite a lot of data. And in this lecture, we will mostly look at the different methodological pieces. I'm just a little bit going to show some results related to the probability of language change, but that comes a little bit later. So this is a team. So just to give you an idea of the number of people that were involved in some phases. I think one of the things that we started with was developing a sampling tool for researching contact in a typological way. So let's assume that we have two populations that use different languages. So group 1 and group 2. So let's say that group 1 is our language of interest. They speak our language of interest, which we call focus language. So let's say that we are interested in South Sami, which is numbered with number 1 on the map there. And then group 2 has the focus language. South Sami here has been in contact with the neighbor language, which here is Swedish. So this is sort of our test case, this contact scenario. And the question is then that if there has been contact, or if there still is social contact between these two groups, and there's at least some evidence that the focus language has become similar with the neighbor language in some respects, how can we validate that this is actually the result of language contact, and that this increased similarity is not just the result of some random processes, but how can we say that it's about language contact and not something else? So this is a pressing question, and we need some validation in order to make reasonable inferences. So let's say discuss an example, for instance, about word order. So one of the things that typologists tend to be quite interested in is word order, and especially dominant word order, or something like pragmatically neutral word order. And here I put here some feature values for South Sami and Swedish. So the pragmatically neutral word order in Swedish is SVO, subject, verb, object. In South Sami, the pragmatically neutral word order SOV can be used as pragmatically neutral, but SVO, according to the sources that I looked at, was also argued that SVO is a pragmatically neutral word order in South Sami. So we could say that, okay, in terms of SVO, there is this similarity between South Sami and Swedish, but can we make the claim that this similarity is because of language contact or not? So what sort of data could we use to make this kind of a case? So just perceived similarity is not enough. We need some validation. So preferentially, we need some data from the focus language from the time before the contact started between the focus and neighbor group. So before, for instance, South Sami or Proto-South Sami got in contact with Swedish. We also need some data from the neighbor language, preferably from the time before the contact, that we know that this pattern existed in the neighbor language, so in Swedish, before the contact. Then we need some evidence that there actually was some contact between the focus and neighbor communities. And then we need some evidence that the pattern occurs in the focus language after the contact has started. The challenge in this this process is that we often have limited historical data for the pre-contact time. And there are different ways that we can try to go about that. But of course, there's nothing that beats historical data. So ideally, we would use historical data from several points in time, especially for the focus language predating the contact, in order to make inferences about contact that the change that we think has happened in the focus language is actually because of language contact. But the challenge with historical data is that this kind of data is available for only a minority of the world's languages, usually languages spoken by elites of dominating and large empires. Very rarely available for minority languages or minoritized people that tend to be pastoralists or hunter-gatherers. Another technique that we can use, or data source, is that we can try to reconstruct an earlier form. So we can use synchronic data from dialects or related languages to reconstruct or to get an idea of the pre-contact patterns in the focus language. The challenge here is that if we want to do typological scale work, so to compare, let's say, 10, 20, or 50 contact scenarios across the world, the workload it's gigantic. It's just enormous. For some particular phenomena where the data is well available, this may be okay. So for instance, for person number marking on the verb, Ilya Zerzad has done this kind of work. So this is possible to use reconstructions or reconstruct yourself. But the problem is really workload. When you want to work on dozens of different contact scenarios, doing reconstructions, it's not feasible. Another possibility could be to borrow a method from sociolinguistics, which is called a parent time construct. So the idea is that we collect data from children, adults, and older people, and then compare their language use. And if it seems that children and adults are speaking differently compared to older people, we can make inferences of that perhaps there's a language change going on. There are different problems with this methodology, but it's being used in sociolinguistics a lot. But again, there's the problem that about enormous workload that we will need to collect a lot of data from different context scenarios in order to make some kind of a typological case about, for instance, probability of contact, of probability of language change in the world's languages. So what we would need is some kind of control data. For instance, if we look at the word order features here again, so we have the data for Swedish South Sami. So preferably we would use historical data from South Sami prior to its contact with Swedish, but perhaps we can use data from other Samic languages to argue for whether either one of these patterns is the result of borrowing from Swedish. Well, most likely SOV in South Sami has not been borrowed from Swedish, but SVO perhaps has. SVO word order does occur in many other Samic languages also, but to my knowledge, it's not pragmatically neutral word order in them, unlike in South Sami. So in the function of pragmatically neutral word order, we might be able to make the case that this particular feature has been borrowed from Swedish. So perhaps we can reconstruct just SOV as a pragmatically neutral word order to, let's say, to Samic, but that SVO has been borrowed from Swedish. But then the question is that how many Sami languages would we need for this kind of reconstructions? And could we do with just a few or even just one well selected control language. So this is actually where I'm going, and I'm going to briefly tell about another case study that we did. So this case study is about the Austronesian language Alorese and Adang, which is a Timor Alor Pantar language, and these are unrelated and spoken in eastern parts of Indonesia. So Alorese here branched off from Lamaholot, probably from somewhere from the western parts of this map, something like 600 years ago or less than 600 years ago, and then moved to these two islands, Pantar and Alor. I'm not going into the social history of these groups, but we're just gonna see some data and discuss some data. Okay, let's take some data from these. So word order data again. So noun genitive order. So in possessive noun phrases, is noun genitive word order possible? Is genitive noun word order possible? So in quite many European languages, we have the genitive noun order, like in Finnish, Swedish, and so on. In Swedish, there's also the noun genitive word order. Both are also attested in English. So the noun genitive word order, it doesn't occur either in Alorese or Adang. The genitive noun occurs in Alorese and Adang. So in terms of these two features, these languages seem to be similar. But again, we need some control data. So what we did is that we analyzed about 20 closely related languages of Alorese. And then we applied phylogenetic computational methods, Bayesian methods, to do ancestral state reconstructions. So with the help of these methods, we tried to estimate the probability of this feature value in the branch of the root. So the orange and blue features here next to the language names represents the orange represents that genitive noun word order doesn't exist in this language, and the blue means that the genitive noun word order exists in this language. And when we apply these computational methods, we can see that in the root, the probability of having genitive noun word order is very close to 100%. It's probably not 100%, but it's very close to 100%. And then we can set up some kind of a threshold, maybe 90% or 95%, and then based on that, make an assumption that in the proto language there was no genitive noun word order in this let's say that this root of the whole subfamily, or if we look at this particular lower part of the tree where there is Lamaholot and Lewotopi. Lamaholot is the group from which Alorese branched off, so it's a close relative. So even the next or this reconstructed form here, maybe just 2 or 3% probability that there was genitive noun word order here, but it's quite likely that we can reconstruct genitive noun word order even to this lower branch. So we used these methods for making inferences about a lot of different features related to possessive noun phrases in Alorese, Adang, and these other languages related to Alorese. And the outcome was that we compared then these inferences about language contact based on ancestral state reconstructions to inferences about language contact based on selecting just one single benchmark language. And the outcome was quite interesting. that these inferences based on ancestral state reconstructions did not deviate significantly from those when we used just a single benchmark, like Lama-Holot, for instance, in order to make inferences about contact. So this will become a little bit clearer what I mean by making inferences along the way. There was a question in chat. Let me see, can I? I actually can't see the chat without ending the slideshow.
I can just read it.
Okay,
So
great,
that's
thanks.
a fairly long one, but
Okay.
the question is, I have always wondered if the literacy rate nowadays have changed the intensity of contact in some specific areas. I mean, if the literacy rate enhances the changes or protects the language from some kind of changes, etc. Since literacy rate was different in historical time. I don't know the case of Sami people, but I infer they usually read their own language, read probably their own language, but also Swedish others. On the other hand, native speaker of Austronesian, Papuan languages have a different literacy rates, so the influence comes mostly from other sources.
Yes, this is actually a good question and something that, yeah, we might be able to answer that question more probably later on, maybe in 1 or 2 years' time. But you're absolutely right that literacy rates are quite different in different parts of the world. What literacy does is there's a little bit just thinking aloud that on the one hand, if you read material in different languages, you will be exposed to especially vocabulary, but also different structures from different languages, and then that may cause interferences. Different kinds of structural borrowing. So for instance, relative clauses have been borrowed because of writing systems and literacy in many parts of the world. That's my understanding. But then it might be also true that when people learn to read and write, that that may be some kind of a blockage against borrowing and interference from other languages. So this is something that we haven't specifically looked at, but it would be interesting. I think it would make sense to formulate different kinds of hypotheses that could then be tested with these sorts of data. Okay, good. Maybe I'll continue from here. Okay, so what we propose in my project is this kind of a sampling tool for language context situations. So let's take our test case, the contact between South Sami and Swedish. So we have attested contact between the focus and the neighbor groups, here South Sami and Swedish. In this project, we limit ourselves to contact between unrelated languages so that we can rule out similarity between the focus and neighbor that may have come from just shared inheritance, just for the fact that they are related languages. So we want to rule that out. But then we select a control case, what we call the benchmark language, that's related to the focus, but hasn't been in contact with the focus language or the neighbor language. And in this particular context scenario, we select it's called Sami, which is number 6 on the map. So we make the argument that we have a few criteria, but these are our most important criteria, that the focus and neighbor are unrelated and the benchmark hasn't been in contact with the focus and neighbor. Of course, we could select more benchmarks, more neighbors, and we're expanding our work to such cases and to make better inferences about contact. But we make the case that we could make do with just one benchmark language. And already arrive at reasonable inferences about contact. So we have selected about 50 sets of 3 languages, roughly 150 languages from the world. So here the green are benchmarks, and red focus, and the purple is neighbor languages. This is, so you can see that the languages are rather spread out across the world. We did sample some from Europe also. This is maybe just a little bit outdated map. But on the other hand, so many different languages in Europe are spoken by rather large people groups. And we try to avoid choosing, especially, try to avoid using large colonial languages as the focus language. That would have led to different kinds of problems and issues. So many of our languages in this sample are from smaller languages, actually. So that's good to keep in mind. So let's go to variable design then. How did we approach different linguistic patterns when analyzing the data? So what sorts of linguistic variables we analyzed? So we analyzed data from 5 broad domains: 2 phonological variables, syllable structure and word prosody, 2 from morphosyntax, nominal number, and possessive noun phrases, and then adnominal demonstratives, which you could say that they are sort of partly morphosyntactic, partly semantic lexical domains, at least the way that we approach them. We mostly focus on structural patterns, so we don't analyze loan words. We don't analyze, for instance, inflectional affixes or adpositions, their actual forms, so that have these actual adpositions or particles being borrowed, but we rather analyze whether structural patterns, for instance, word order, or some other patterns like that, have been borrowed. I'll give you some examples in just a minute. We analyze grammar descriptions and other descriptive work, like is typical in typology. And we made the assumption that when there is language contact, that contact effects start out as minor patterns. That when you borrow something from another language, that it doesn't right away become some kind of a central pattern in the target language. But it may start out in a small pockets of the grammar, for instance, or in the phonological system, and then spread out to other areas from there. So we argue that capturing language internal variation is something that we need in order to identify contact effects. And this led us to analyze something like 20-25 features per domain to understand the language internal variation better. So again, I use word order to illustrate what I mean by looking at language internal variation. So for instance, for word order, it's quite typical in typological research to analyze the dominant word order. So what is the dominant word order of a language? What is the basic word order or pragmatically neutral word order in transitive clauses? So for instance, in English, it's clear that the dominant word order is subject, verb, object. Mary ate ice cream, for instance. It's some other orders are also possible, specifically object, subject, verb. Verb initial order is not really possible in English. But we make the case that focusing on dominant word order is not necessarily feasible, because if we focus on something that's a dominant patterns may change rather slowly. And if we analyze this kind of patterns, then we sort of prioritize the stable patterns from the outset. But rather that it's better to look at what's possible in the language, what's possible and what occurs in the grammar. So instead of looking at dominant word order in transitive clauses, it would be better to look at something like context-specific word order or language internal variation in word order. So for instance, asking whether the variant is possible, and if yes, in which context it occurs. So Mary ate ice cream, subject, verb, object order could be used in what is called predicate focused constructions. So as an answer to a question, what happened? But then the object, subject, verb construction, ice cream Mary ate, could be used in another construction, namely expressing contrastive focus. So in this way, we can already start getting a hold of variation in terms of what happens in terms of the word order, and then we can start looking at where these particular variants occur and start making notes and observations and classifications about that context. Another example about possessive noun phrases, which I focus on in the project. So possessive noun phrases, your typical possessive constructions expressing ownership, kinship relations, and so on. For instance, my bike, the girl's bike, the brakes of the bike, and so on. So in these constructions, the possessive noun phrase, the possessor is the syntactic dependent. So my, or the girl's, or of the bike, that's the syntactic dependence. It's a semantic possessor. And then the possessum is the syntactic head, the item that's owned. So here, the bike. So what we analyze in terms of possessive noun phrases, we analyze, for instance, locus of marking, which I'm going to illustrate on the next slide. Then contextual factors, for instance, whether the possessor is a pronoun or a noun, whether the possessive relationship is what is called alienable versus inalienable possession. So for instance, my bike, that's alienable possession, but my hand, that's inseparable, inalienable possession. Then we looked at linear order in possessive constructions, if it's genitive noun, noun genitive, or both. And then, for instance, boundness of the marker, if there is some morphological marker, for instance, genitive case or some kind of a particle, or possessive suffix, for instance, which is quite typical of Uralic languages. So we analyze whether these markers are bound or independent. So here we used Johanna Nichols's typology for locus of marking. So looking at what's called dependent marking, head marking, double marking, and zero marking. So the idea here is that where is the syntactic relation between the head and dependent morphologically marked? So in dependent marking, for instance, in colloquial Finnish, minun talo, it's marked on the dependent, there's genitive case. In Hungarian, typically, there's a morphological marking on the head noun, so there's head marking. In Finnish, like in some other Uralic languages, there may be double marking, so there's some morphological marking like genitive case on the possessor, on the dependent, but there's something also on the head, minun taloni. So that's standard Finnish. And then zero marking, that there's no morphological marking whatsoever. So there's no head marking on the head, and then the possessor is also not marked. So in Skoltsami, for instance, when you have plural pronouns, the nominative and genitive forms are identical. So when you express our village, it's literally we village. So we analyze in these cases that this is an example of zero marking. Okay, let me see how I'm doing with time. Okay, still some time left, but not too much. Okay, but this hopefully gave you some idea about the kinds of detail that we go into when analyzing different features about possessive constructions. So we analyze altogether about 200 different features from these 5 domains that we have here from most domains, something like 20, 25 features, from some domains, many more, so that we can make reasonable inferences about contact effects. Let's then move on to making inferences about contact. So now we come to the point where we analyze the analytical tool from our sampling method to making inferences about contact effects. So we can ask, for instance, how similar are the focus and neighbor languages in terms of each variable, and how do these similarities between the focus and neighbor compare against the control data, the benchmark language that we have selected. So here we can think about these 5 different features as different features related to possessive marking, for instance. So in terms of this particular feature, the focus, neighbor, and benchmark each have this particular feature, so they have the feature value yes. So here we can't make any inferences about whether this similarity is because of contact, inheritance, or something. Here, in the second case, the focus and benchmark are similar and the neighbor is different. So here we argue that we can make the case that the focus has, because the focus and benchmark have the same feature, that we can assume that maybe the focus has retained the feature that it has inherited from its ancestor, and we use the benchmark as a proxy for that. For this particular feature, the focus and neighbor share feature value and the benchmark is different. And we argue that these sorts of cases are examples of convergence, that the focus has become more similar with the neighbor and different from the benchmark. And likewise here, that the focus has lost a particular feature that it used to have, but it has lost it because of its contact with the neighbor. And then the final logical possibility that the focus language is different from the neighbor and benchmark. So here we can maybe talk about genuine innovations, some kind of divergences where the focus becomes different from the neighbor, but also from its related languages. Now, from these features, if we want to focus on assessing the probability of convergence, for instance, we would delimit our study to cases where the neighbor and benchmark have a different feature value to begin with. And then we can assess whether the focus language has become similar to the neighbor or has retained the feature value that it has inherited from its ancestor. So for instance, here we have what we call 3 possibilities where the focus could have become more like the neighbor, but we don't know, has it become more like the neighbor? And then the similarities here illustrate these 2 cases of convergence where the focus language has become more like the neighbor. So we can aggregate evidence from different features in this way and then come up with what we call the similarity score. So here we can say that 2 features out of 3 suggest evidence for convergence and 1 feature out of 3 suggests evidence for inheritance. So this is the way that we use the sampling scheme for making inferences about contact, and also the way that we aggregate evidence from these features. But just looking at these fractions or turning them into decimals may not be so helpful. So if we think about fractions like 15, 25, or 3 out of 5, well, if we have 15 features out of 25 that suggest evidence for convergence, somehow intuitively that makes for a stronger case for convergence compared to if we have 3 features out of 5 suggesting evidence for convergence. But if we simply turn this into a decimal, they are both 0.6, 0.6. So somehow we would like to tap this greater evidence in the 15 out of 25 and argue that there's somehow stronger evidence there, less uncertainty about the underlying probability compared to the case, excuse me, 3 out of 5. So how can we turn this intuition into some tangible measures of contact effects? And now we come into some mathematics that we applied, and I won't go on, don't be scared about this. I won't go into any detail here. But what we did is that we took these fractions, 15 out of 25 and 3 out of 5, and we used what is called a beta distribution, and we turned these fractions into continuous probability distributions so that we can assess the uncertainty related to these fractions. So if you look at the blue curve here, it has sort of a much wider range compared to the yellow curve, which is much narrower. So the narrower yellow curve gives sort of more limited range of probabilities. So to the underlying unknown probability. So this is what we do quantitatively for the similarity scores to turn them into probability distributions, but we don't need to spend more time here. Okay, a few words about the sociolinguistic analysis, just a little bit about the results, and then I think we can have about 15 minutes at the end for discussion. Okay, so we have now spent quite a bit of time on our methodology, how we identify language contact, outcomes of language contact, how we aggregate the evidence with our method. But we also developed methods for analyzing the sociolinguistic side of language contact. And this is, like I mentioned, something that Eri will talk more next week, but I'm going to just say a few things about this. So what we did is that we did a massive survey of the sociolinguistic literature related to language contact and also the cognitive science literature on language contact, and then developed a sociolinguistic questionnaire that contained more than 200 questions related to the dynamics of the social interaction between speakers of different languages in bilingual contexts. And then we invited different experts who knew these context situations well to answer the questionnaire. So many of these answers are not based on individual data from the actual language users. Some are, because some of our experts actually collected that kind of data or had collected that kind of data in their earlier work. So mostly these judgments are based on the experts' observations during their field work. What we did in this questionnaire is that we didn't have 233 questions that were completely separate from one another. But for the bulk of the questionnaire, we had something like 30 questions that we repeated over 6 social domains. So we asked the same questions in terms of family and kin, in terms of trade relations, in terms of work-related interactions, and so on. So we split up social interactions into these 6 social domains and then asked these questions mostly relative to these social domains. So I'm going to give you an example from social network part of the questionnaire. So for instance, how often do focus group people, so South Sami, trade with a neighbor group, for instance, Swedish? And then we had predefined answers and also some instructions and guidelines for the respondents, our experts, how to interpret our scale, our predetermined answers. So for instance, here we have a Likert scale, kind of predetermined responses ranging from very infrequently to very frequently. And of course, it's sort of difficult for an expert to say that, okay, well, if these people groups meet once a year, is that frequent or infrequent? It's probably quite infrequent. But if that once a year means that they spend about a month in the same marketplace so that they meet every day, well, perhaps that's already towards a little bit more frequent. Not very infrequently, but maybe a little bit higher up the scale. So we gave these kinds of examples to the experts that guided their responses in the questionnaire. Related to work, for instance, we asked these sorts of questions. How often do the focus people work with the neighbor people? What is the proportion of the total focus group people who have opportunities for contact with the neighbor group people in work? How long have the focus people and neighbor people worked together for? And what language do the focus people typically speak when working with the neighbor group people? So these sorts of questions and then the feature values that we get from here, we can start putting these together. First of all, how often do they meet? What proportion of the group has opportunities for contact? Which language do they use? So we can aggregate those to come up with something like how much do the focus group people, how much are they exposed to the neighbor language? And then compare those across our sampled communities. There was again a question, so Senja, if you can maybe ask that
Yes.
again.
So the question is, wouldn't it be more precise to measure frequencies or collect answers in numbers, for instance, every week, month, and so on?
This is a very good question. The challenge again is that we need to somehow find a balance between very diverse kind of contact situations. So yes, the starting point could be that, hey, okay, we have here different options. They meet daily, they meet once a week, they meet once a month, or something between. But then when we give these kinds of questionnaires or questions to people who actually work on the field, they may be like, that scale is really unhelpful. I can't really I can't really answer this in any way. So this is why we did some pilot analysis also and asked some people to fill out the questionnaire before we send it out to all the rest of the experts. So to get some feedback whether these questions work at all, is it possible to answer them in the first place? So this was a very, very intense part of working with the questionnaire, trying to figure out what kind of predetermined answers we would give, and then what kind of instructions we would give the experts in trying to help them to, categorize that contact scenario into the predetermined answers. And then we were there also to help them, and then we double checked also their answers, and then asked a lot of questions from them about confirming their answers, and sometimes changed them because maybe they answered in a little bit different way. It made sense to change the answers. Are there other questions there?
No, so far, no.
Okay, good. So let's continue then. Yes. So I think, having this kind of more detailed questions and then aggregating them may help us to come up with some kind of measures of, if you want, intensity of contact, but I don't know if I even like the whole concept of intensity of contact anymore. I think some kind of measures like exposure to the neighbor language or things like this might make more sense cognitively, especially. So, okay, here's another one. Maybe I show this. Maybe Eddie won't show this. So for instance, from the behavioral bias part of the questionnaire, what are the focus group speakers' attitudes towards linguistic transfer from the neighbor language, such as lexical or grammatical borrowing, ranging from very negative to very positive? And here are the responses from the questionnaire. So mostly very negative or negative responses, but some also positive, which is quite interesting also. But if you would like to summarize this somehow, you could say that when asked about language attitudes or attitudes towards linguistic transfer, quite rare people would say that it's a good thing. And I think quite many people here may share that intuition. Okay, just a little bit about results related to the probability of contact, and then a few words about the few concluding words. So this is now more technical again, and we can go into the details of this if you want in the question and discussion time. So here's a procedure for what we did. So for each language, we computed the similarity scores. Then we turned those scores into probability distributions, again, for each language. Then from those probability distributions, we sampled one for each language, one probability for each language. And then we took the mean of those probabilities and then repeated that 10,000 times. So we got a distribution of the means. And here are some summaries of that. So the y-axis is the probability of convergence, and on the x-axis we have different structural domains. So for number, the probability, so aggregating evidence from all the features related to number, the probability of convergence is around 0.4. For possession, about 0.5, just a little bit higher. And when aggregating those together, we get something like 0.45 for morphosyntactic features. For syllable structure, 0.5 again. Lexical prosody, a little bit less, a little bit smaller probability of convergence. And aggregated together, phonological features, very similar to morphosyntactic features. Demonstratives stand out, maybe because there's a little bit less data on them. But overall, the probability of convergence is around 0.4, which tells that the probability of stability or inheritance is still much greater and stronger than the probability of convergence here. But remember that these are languages where that we selected the kind of contact scenarios where we know and knew from the literature that there is some social contact between these people groups. So many of these are actually sort of on the more intense side of contact rather than just casual contact. And here per language, so again on the y-axis probability of convergence, and on the x-axis different sample languages. So Alorese, the case study that we discussed, on the high end, and then South Sami on the low end, and then maybe you can recognize a few languages from here. Burmese, sort of on the middle ground here. Aleut, you may have heard of the language of Santali. So you get the picture that for most of these languages, the probability of convergence is relatively low, or less than 50%. But then there are some for which are, for instance, Alorese, especially if we think about its possessive constructions. In terms of its possessive constructions, it has become almost completely like a dung, which is quite striking if you think about the fact that we know that the Aloris people, they spill it off from Lamaholot about 600 years ago. So it's just during the past 600 years that this kind of drastic change has happened in Aloris. Okay, just a few words to conclude. I hope to have shown here, but also inspired you to think and see how these kinds of tools and methods from language typology may be used for evaluating language contact in a systematic way. I also presented our sampling technique and how we use that technique as a grid for analyzing outcomes of language contact and for making inferences about contact. And this sampling technique also makes it possible for test different kinds of hypotheses about language contact across very, diverse contact scenarios. And it is possible also to analyze the sociolinguistic aspects of contact across context settings in some reasonable ways, in ways that make sense, and collect data on that. Maybe just a few things here more, that the model that we propose, it lets us make typological inferences about contact, and we can compare the probability of convergence across linguistic domains, for instance, or probability of convergence across languages, or we can go into greater detail, like, for instance, Francesca Di Garbo and Panagiotis Kapellis have done in their work on nominal number. So, for instance, they look at different subtypes of inflection, can look at morphological syntactic features in much greater detail, and then also compare those our inferences to what sorts of inferences have been proposed in the literature about, for instance, what sorts of changes there happen in terms of nominal number or possessive constructions and so on. Of course, there's some residue of false positives that our method picks up signals about language contact that turn out to be wrong. But given the fact that we don't have historical data for quite many cases, I think we are sort of reasonably well off, in the sense that our method approximates the kinds of results that we would get with ancestral state reconstructions, for instance. So solving this problem of false positives would require much more data from these particular context scenarios that we are studying, especially much more control data. And this approach, so when put together, the typological approach to language contact and then our approach to the sociolinguistic aspects of contact, with this model, we can start answering these sorts of long-standing questions in language contact research in principled way. For instance, does language change in contact situations depend on some social aspects of contact, such as prestige or dominance or cultural pressure, like Johnson and Kaufman formulated it? But that would be a matter for another lecture or two. So thank you for your attention, and looking forward to your comments.